Brilliant. That's great. So we're all in business. Just to say, folks, final slide for those of you who may be in the wrong place. As we say, as Sam said in his introduction, this is a workshop on research philosophies, approaches and strategies, with plenty of time at the end for you to ask questions on anything at all in related to research. And within this workshop, we're going to be looking at the research onion. Now, Sam's already introduced me a bit, so I won't go into my actual role at Birmingham that much, other than to say the Director of Global Engagement is a phenomenal role, because it's actually about building links and relationships with universities and organisations throughout the world. So I'm really grateful to be having that. What I thought would be useful, just a little bit more of an introduction, was to give you a bit more background of myself in terms of my work, because I think that will help you in terms of being able to ask questions. Has the slide changed happily, Sam? Sam, hello. Can somebody just unmute and say if you can see a second slide now, please, for me, just so I know I'm in the right place?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mark,
I can see this. Yeah.
Hey, thank you guys. That's great.
Yeah,
Mike.
Thanks.
Yep.
Right. So what we've got here is just a sample of some of the textbooks I work. And what I wanted to bring out of this was that on the textbooks, I'm one of those few people who like doing both quantitative research. So you see books on statistics, and also qualitative research. So you see a book on case study, for example. And I tend to do work in human resource management, managing change, and looking at employee relations. And not only do I publish books on that, but I publish journal articles as well on how to teach and issues associated with teaching. The most recent book, which may well be of interest to quite a few of you, is the How to Keep Your Doctorate on Track book, which is actually looking at the realities of doing a doctorate rather than the sanitized account of how straightforward it is, because we all know it isn't. And how we've written that book is we've got contributors to talk from both the doctoral students' perspective and also from supervisors' perspective on the same issues. And it's written in the style of sitting in a coffee bar having a chat. So should be of interest to you. In terms of my work on trust and distrust, come out in a variety of journals, but just to say, just to give you an idea, we've looked at trust and distrust in doctor-patient relationships, trust and distrust in organisations. We looked at it within service industries and more widely across cultures. So a variety of things coming there. And of course, you see the link into a book there on handbooks of research methods on trust. I've also published quite a lot in the areas of HRM. So here's some recent ones in Human Resource Development Quarterly, Training Development, and so on. The training development work is quite interesting. We're arguing that training development research is basically very simplistic and doesn't actually get to understand it within the context. And then quite a lot of work on methods in British Journal of Management, Annals of Tourism Research, Human Performance. In particular, the work I've been focusing on at the moment is that really thorny question of how many interviews are enough. And the short answer is it depends. And the longer answer is, if you want to get published in a top journal, you're probably looking at between 30 and 50. If you're wanting to reach saturation and it's a homogeneous population, about 10 to 15. So it depends very much so. And then finally, I've done quite a lot of work with different organisations. So for many people here today, probably one which has just come up is higher education and training in South Africa, where we've got a really fantastic project with University of Pretoria, looking at doctoral development and working with people in a variety of universities to upskill PhD students. And then there's been work on English language testing, helping small businesses, looking at skills for motor industry, and a variety of different organisations in terms of health authorities, local government, the UK NHS. And at the end result, I'm, as Sam said earlier, a member of the Academy of Social Sciences, British Academy of Management, and also the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development. So folks, that's really me. Are there any questions yet? On the basis that nothing's come back, I'm going to proceed forward. So,
okay.
Thanks. Here we have the first slide. So this is where we're going to end up by the end of today. And I'm really hoping that by the end of the day, you'll be able to explain to other people the different philosophical perspectives. So what do we mean by positivism, interpretism, and so on. and what that means for approaches management research, so how that fits into how we do researchers, management research and business researchers, but also within that, how we have to be systematic and how we have to have a coherent research design. In relation to the philosophies, I'm going to hopefully expect you to be able to explain terms like epistemology, so things, the nature of knowledge, and in particular what's acceptable knowledge, terms like ontology, that's your own assumptions you have about the nature of reality or being, and then terms like axiology, the role of values in your research, and in particular the role of your values and of the researcher's value in how they do research. But not only just explain them, but also where do you sit in the debates associated with these, and how does this impact on your own research? Now, these terms are really crucial, not in terms of the labels themselves, but in terms of what they mean for how you do research and how your values, what's acceptable knowledge, impact upon that. I'd also like to spend a bit of time talking about deductive research. So that's where you start with a hypothesis, for example, and collect data to test that hypothesis. Inductive research, where you start with data and then build hypotheses from the data. And abductive research, where you move back and forth between the two. But not just talk about being able to distinguish that, but also see how do these impact on your research and the way you're doing research. Because really what we're all about, without exception today, is we're about doing the best possible research we can do to actually answer questions that are important. And by important, I mean important to us, important to the people we live with, important people we work with or for, and important to our lives and other people's lives. And next thing is I want to be able you to be able to identify the main research strategies. And I want you to think about, should different research strategies be mutually exclusive? And that is very much a debate we can have perhaps in the chat, or you can have afterwards, but it's something to think about. And I want you to think about using multiple methods in collecting research. So combining more than one data collection method and more than one analysis method. So we've got a fair bit to cover over the time today, but as Sam said, we've got a break coming in at 10:30 UK time. So take whatever time you started and add an hour and a half to it, and that will be, we'll have a half-hour break then. It may be slightly earlier, it may be slightly later, depending on how we're getting through the slides. And then we'll also have breakouts before then, and we've got breakout rooms already organised so you can discuss things. So what we're really doing is we're working our way through the research onion, and this onion is probably what most people know me for. So my guess is that's probably similar for most of you guys out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yep.
thank you. It's good to have some voices coming back, and thank
you.
Yeah. With the onion, that started life living on my whiteboard in my office, and I shared an office with another guy called Phil, and it lived on my whiteboard, and every single person who came into my office, I said, what do you reckon to this? And the comments that came back were, oh, I don't like that bit, or isn't that more like that? So that was developed with colleagues and students over a period of about 6 months. And I wanted to put it in the research methods book, and Phil said, oh, I'm not sure. And Adrian said, no, it's rubbish, we shouldn't put that in. So I said, no, I'm in charge of this book, I'm putting it in. I was saying this is important. And it's had a life of its own. I think there's been 4 or 5 PhDs written on it now, which is quite amazing. But more importantly, what the crucial thing is for you guys is what it's about is saying we have that white bit in the middle which says data collection and data analysis, and that's where you end up. But all the outside layers are things you have to think about to ensure you select the right data collection, data analysis tools and techniques to be able to answer your research question or to meet your aim and objectives. So these are all things and decisions you have to make. So what it's really saying is that place where you end up has a lot of thought going in behind it. And what we, in effect, we're doing is we're talking about the outer layers of things you have to think about. And today we're talking about issues of the philosophy layer, the approach to theory development layer, and in particular the strategies layer, and we'll also talk a little bit about the methodological choice, the mono method, the multi method as well. So, and the reasons behind those. So it's a very useful tool to follow through and to force you to think about the other aspects, and that's what it was designed for all those years ago. So anyway, let's get into doing something. Right. This is time where I'm quite happy for you guys to switch your microphones off and actually say something. So here we have a situation, and the situation is of team workers being briefed and before the start of their working day in a factory. And what I'd like people to do is to say, think about what could be a research question there, first of all. So what do you think could be a research question? Switch your microphone off if you've got an idea, talk it out, and then we'll take that and run with it. So what could be your research question?
A job to do for the day.
Yeah, so research question, that's obviously the question that the managers are asking the workers. And my guess is, just looking at there, you can guess who the managers are, can't you? They're the ones on the left. And they're briefing people about the job for the day. But what would a research question be about?
Can I say something? Can
Yeah.
I say something?
Yeah.
Dr. Abdi is my name.
Thank you.
Can say, to what extent is worker management relationship having an effect on organizational performance?
Right. Let's take that. People put their microphones
Okay.
on. I mean,
You want me to repeat it? To what extent
yeah,
is worker management relationship having an effect on organizational performance?
brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I've written that down, so I've got it in front of me. It's to what extent is worker management relationships having an effect on organizational performance? And that's quite a nice research question, because when you ask something as to what extent, you're not saying it is having an effect, and you're not saying it isn't effect. You're leaving it open, and you've got a cause and effect relationship coming in there quite nicely. Okay, so we've got a research question in there. So if we take that as our research question, and we can have microphones back on again, what are the beliefs and assumptions behind that? So in asking that question, what beliefs do we have? What assumptions do we have? So how do we think the world works, for example?
Worker productivity is not encouraging.
So we could be starting from the basis that there is a problem with worker productivity within this organization, couldn't we? That could be a belief. But the way we've phrased our question is quite clearly not actually defining it as a problem at the moment. So we're being a bit more open at this at the moment, which is quite helpful to see. So that's one of the beliefs we could have. What else might we have?
Low productivity.
Yeah. So we could have a belief in low productivity. Okay. So what this is saying is, folks, is as we come into doing any research, we bring into our research some of our own assumptions and beliefs. Now, certain worldviews, certain ontological views would say we can get rid of those, we can put them to one side and approach our research completely value neutrally. Other people will say, no, that's not possible. And what we do is, when we come in to undertake our research, although we may try to put our own worldviews, our own beliefs and assumptions to one side, invariably they will impact upon the research we do. And within business and management and a large number of the social sciences, there are different views within the same subject area. So some people will say the researcher can be value neutral, and their values and beliefs will not affect what they do. Other people will say, no, that isn't the case, and the way they've been brought up, just the worldview they have, their previous life experiences will invariably impact on how they look at things. So we've now got to the stage where we have a research question: to what extent is worker management relationships having an effect on organizational performance? And we have some, for the sake of taking this forward, some beliefs and assumptions. And belief assumptions that we have is that there is a problem with workers and there's low productivity. So if we're now researching this, what data do you think would be acceptable and to whom? And again, microphones off and answer. So what data would be acceptable and to whom?
It's still certainly going to be a questionnaire.
Okay, so one possibility would say it's a questionnaire, okay?
And it will be issued to both parties, both the management and the staff of the organization.
Okay, thank you for that. That's certainly one really interesting suggestion, and it's certainly not wrong. But does anybody have an alternative suggestion?
Yes,
There could be interview.
Hang on, there were two people talking there, so one of you, let's have the person who sounded as if they were female first and then the male second. So the female first.
Well, I don't know who sounded female, but
Oh dear.
can I go ahead?
Yeah, of course you can. Sorry about that.
I mean, no, what I want to say here is that I don't know whether in sort of carrying out this kind of research, you should first of all have a benchmark which you use to judge productivity or the outputs of your staff. I mean, without having some kind of benchmark or some levels, you wouldn't measure what the productivity is and where they are. So I would think that maybe in devising the company's production strategies, there should be some level of productivity embedded in the research, so that you can know where you want to go and why you haven't been there.
Excellent, thank you. So that's sort of saying acceptable knowledge would have to be benchmarked so we could see whether what we considered to be low or high was sensible to label it as such by looking at other organizations or perhaps previous levels in the same organization, with some idea of benchmarking.
Correct.
Any other ideas on what would be acceptable knowledge? Okay, we'll have the microphones off for a minute and let me just come back to you with some ideas here. What you guys have said is that in order to understand the extent to which a worker management relationship has an effect on organizational performance, we need to collect data which we can quantify. So you were very much going down data which would measure organizational performance in that numerical terms. So some form of output, perhaps in a canteen, number of meals served or amount of waste of food, things like that. But if you look at that question you came up with, worker management relationships, how do you hadn't really come across talking about how do you measure the relationships? What do people feel about them? And that becomes more difficult. So it might be there that, yes, do come in, yes.
I think I'd rather go for qualitative data.
Yeah, exactly. So it may well be that it would be useful to collect some qualitative data about how people, both the managers and the workers, actually understand that relationship and what they consider to be important within that. So what we're seeing here is, with one question, the way we look at our beliefs and assumptions is going to impact, our beliefs and assumptions are going to impact on what's acceptable knowledge, and also the aspects we look at. I brought in, for example, the fact that I was interested in the relationships between these people and how they work together, and actually understand it from both sides' perspectives. Now, and as it was something we didn't know much about, and it was something where we'd have to explore first, perhaps a qualitative approach, perhaps interviewing might be more useful. Alternatively, we could have said, let's use a time and motion study and actually observe what these people are doing and see, are they working efficiently? So there's lots of different things.
If I may ask a question.
Yeah, of course you can.
With something like looking at the spatial organization of the company or site be a form of data that can be included in a question like this. So looking at the environment.
Exactly. Indeed you could. So you could look at relationship proximities, say between actually within the canteen itself, but also between different buildings on site, and how that affected the amount of time people had to take away from work to get food. So there's lots of different ways to do it. So what we're seeing here is the assumptions and beliefs we bring and our form and our knowledge impacts on how we could answer these research questions. None of the suggestions you've made are wrong. In fact, all of them are really interesting and exciting, but it depends on how we want to answer that research question. Now, if we're working from doing work for an organization, applied research, then the organization will have some very clear issues, outputs they want from the research. And find they're about finding out rather than telling them a specific answer, then we can actually work with that. What we don't want them is to tell us the answer they want, because we obviously need to find out what's actually going on. But all the time here, we need to be very clear about what the question we're trying to answer and how we and our values and assumptions impact on what knowledge is going to be acceptable, and then how we're going to think that later. Are we okay to move on, folks? Yep, I believe we are. Right. So what we're doing here is we've been thinking about our research philosophies as a reflexive process, and by something being reflexive, it means that, well, as a reflexive process, it means that we think about the impact we're having as researchers on the research topic and the people who are being researched. And so this is our beliefs and assumptions we've just been looking at. Things like the what we consider acceptable knowledge, the nature of reality and the role of our own values. That's impact upon our research philosophies, and our research philosophies partially dictate our beliefs and assumptions, and both of those come down and they impact upon our research design. So all these things are interrelated, and what we're really saying is that, or I'm saying, is that research philosophy matters. And that's because research philosophy is about the beliefs and assumptions we make during our research. Now, if you think about it, when we looked at the picture of the team workers and having their briefing, the canteen workers, we immediately made assumptions. One of the assumptions, my guess is that all of us made, I certainly did, was that the people on the left in the skirts and white blouses were the managers, and the people on the right with the aprons and the headdresses were the workers. Then as the questions came up, or the question came up and the methods of doing it, we were making assumptions about things. We were making assumptions that managers and their relationship with workers will affect performance. We were making assumptions about productivity. We were making assumptions about which sorts of data were acceptable to the organization, and quite a lot of the assumptions were there that quantitative data tended to be more acceptable to organizations than qualitative data. I mean, as an aside, I think that's, and so one of the interesting things that happens when we're looking at these data, we often make the assumption that organizations like quantitative data, but what we actually see is they like quantitative data, but what wins hearts and souls is the qualitative illustrations behind that. So just to illustrate that work, looking at providing support for people who have children with learning difficulties, and some work I was doing a few years ago, and the sending in of people to support these people. And we were asked to find out what the families felt about this. And we did a quantitative survey because they wanted numbers, but it was the qualitative comments that actually told the real story. There was this amazing comment from one of the parents saying, my child cannot speak and they cannot obviously write, and they're blind. But what is noticeable is that when they hear the carer's voice, their arms go outstretched and they smile. And that was much more powerful than any quantitative data in illustrating the importance of the role these carers had. So we're very much here looking at how the systems of belief and assumptions about everything affect the research we do. And what I want you to think about is your views on your assumptions about the nature of reality. And we're going to be looking at the Heart questionnaire in a while and how your assumptions of reality affect your research philosophy. I want you to be thinking again about your assumptions about what constitutes acceptable, valid, and legitimate knowledge, and also how we communicate this knowledge to other people. And I also want you to be thinking about the role of your own values and the role of acting and researching ethically and how important that is it. So really what I'm saying is that you, everybody on this webinar, all 132 of you, have a research philosophy, and that is based on your beliefs and assumptions and your values. But hopefully soon you're going to be aware, much more aware of your beliefs and assumptions. And what I want you to think about also is, are they systematic? And by that, I mean, do they all fit together? So here's going to be a little quiz for you to do on your own, or one question actually. And I'm not going to give you the answer yet, but what I want you to do is to read through the next slide. And I want you to actually write down, is this systematic or not? So all you need to do is, in relation to this slide, is write down systematic or not systematic. So does it all fit together? This dissertation is based on a premise that very little is actually known about why formal organizational change programs have such a high failure rate. The aim of the research is therefore an in-depth exploration of the possible reasons for such failure. In particular, the study will look at the interpretations of failure by senior managers. 200 questionnaires have been sent to senior managers around the UK to test the relationships between the common causes of failure and their effects. The responses were analysed statistically using the SPSS. The key finding is that resistance to change is the most common cause of failure of formal organisational change programmes, which supports previous studies. Now, what I'm interested in you thinking through and making a note of is whether that research, as described in terms of how the method is put over, is systematic or not. So does it all fit together? Is it consistent? Don't want an answer yet, but I want you just to note that down, and we'll come back to it later. Okay. Do we have any questions so far at all? Sam, any questions coming up?
No, not really. So, I mean, it's just comments. So the last comment here was someone said, I agree with you. The views of managers, workers, and customers all count, but no real questions yet.
Thank you for agreeing with me. Okay, let's move on then, guys. So let's have a look at the assumptions that management researchers make. And we're going to start off by looking at the word ontological. So ontological assumptions are about the world and the nature of reality. So they're your own personal assumptions about the world, what reality is, and they will determine how you see what you're researching. So if we were to look at that, for example, do we see organizations as something which is static and be shown as a chart, or do we see organizations about organizing and managing things, so something that is fluid and already changing? That's basically how you see the reality, or two ways you could see the reality of an organization. So the important point behind this is, what are your ontological assumptions, and what are in other words, how do you see reality, and how does that impact upon your research? to give it a little bit more concrete, perhaps, recently a colleague and I were looking at trust between doctors and patients. And we approached this research both having a reality and an understanding of this, which had come from our previous histories of employment. I used to work in social care, and my colleague used to work in intensive care nursing. So we came to that with an understanding of how that world worked. And so the reality that we were seeing could well have been different from other people's. So we were very clear in our own research to actually explain our backgrounds, because we knew that would impact on the research we were doing. It also impacts on the theoretical frameworks you choose for your research, the sorts of data you look at. I'm increasingly interested in people's perceptions and the minutiae of the way they view their daily lives and how that impacts on trust. And it impacts on what you notice. My background in social care means I tend to notice certain things in the way people interact. And certainly when I'm looking at doctor-patient relationships, because I have a knowledge of those from previous working roles, it impacts on the sorts of things I'm looking for as I'm collecting data. So I think it's really important to think about you as you are, where you've come from, the life experiences you've had, the sorts of books you've read, the research you've read, and how that impacts on the way you're going to do your research. So your ontological assumptions, your assumption about the nature of reality. Just think about what's going on has gone on in the world. I'm going to use an example from the UK on purpose, because then it makes it neutral for everybody else. And in the UK, we had the UK's relationship with Ireland in the past has been very, very troubled, for want of a better way. And within that, there were people setting off bombs, which invariably were killing people both in Ireland and in the UK. Now, for some, the people setting off bombs, and certainly for the UK government, were called terrorists. But for the people who were actually trying to move out from British rule in Ireland, they weren't terrorists, they were freedom fighters. So the reality depended on the viewpoint of the person who was looking at it. An extreme example, but it illustrates how the way you look at things impacts. Sorry, do we have a question?
Yeah, sorry, Mark. We've got 2 questions in the chat box.
Okay.
So we've got a question from Duke.
Yes.
And the question is the assumptions determined from the literature? That's one question.
Okay.
And then there's another question from Sam Nekri, which is, would you talk about systematic knowledge in humanities also?
About systematic, sorry, I didn't quite get the word.
About systematic knowledge in humanities also.
Right. Okay. I'm going to start with the second question because it leads into the first question quite nicely. Okay. So about systematic knowledge in humanities. I'm a social scientist, so I would feel very, very concerned about being able to say what goes on in the humanities. So because that includes arts and social sciences. So if we narrow it down to social sciences, I would say that there is systematic knowledge, yes, but there is conflicting systematic knowledge, in that even within business and management, which is has been my discipline now for 25 years, different groups will look at the same topic very differently and have very different views. So for example, when I was doing the work on looking at sample size, some people were arguing from the viewpoint that we had to select sample size for interviews, looking at from a positivistic viewpoint, and what mattered was having a sample which was statistically representative. Other people were arguing from a more interpretive viewpoint and saying what mattered was being able to understand the minutiae. So the actual size of sample was far less important, and what was much more crucial was the fact that the sample was large enough to gain useful insights. So what we're seeing in there is different views, but based on systematic knowledge within the discipline. So there's a range of different systematic knowledges, and that means there's also going to Duke's question, there are a variety of different assumptions that you can gain from literature, and invariably everything we read will impact on how we look at things. And that, Duke, and by the way, Duke, when I finish, and other colleague, do come back to me on this. The idea of assumptions from the literature is really crucial, and it's important to recognize that as we read, we learn, and what we read impacts on how we look at things and how we look at things in the future, and to be aware of that. So invariably we will be impacted upon what we do, what we read will impact on what we do, and we need to be aware of the assumptions made in literature and talk about these when we undertake our research. Has that answered your question, Duke, and also the other colleague? Do come back. I can see you've lit up, so do tell me, is that okay?
Yeah, and then Mark, sorry if you don't mind, there's 2 more questions here. There's one question which says, from Kathy,
Yeah.
Can one's ontological viewpoint vary depending on the type of research project one is undertaking?
Ah.
So that's the question from Kathy.
Kathy, you have basically asked what I call the chicken and the egg question. Does your ontology come before your research project, or does your research project is your research project defined by your ontology, or does your ontology define your research project? And the honest answer is, my personal answer is, I think it depends on how strong you are wedded to a particular ontological view. For some people, it would just be not so uncomfortable to do research which went against their beliefs about the nature of reality and research and how they see their research objects, that they couldn't do it. So again, their ontology would define the methods they use. For other people, they will start with a research question. Quite often they're from a pragmatist viewpoint, and they will say, I would adopt this form of ontological view to answer this research question. So it depends on you. Okay, any other questions, Sam?
Yeah, yes, there's one more.
Okay.
So this question is from Barbara, and her question is, how do you develop your research philosophy as an early career research scientist?
Oh my giddy aunt, Barbara. You guys are asking some phenomenal questions and making me really think. So that's how do you do it? I think our research philosophies are actually there, and what we actually need to do is to actually bring them out from the subconscious and out into the open. That's what we're going to be doing as we go along. As a researcher, I had no idea what my research philosophy is. In fact, I was trained as a positivist research philosopher, as a positivist researcher, which means basically there is one way of doing it and that's the right way, and you don't need to know about anything else. And life was very straightforward. But then I discovered that the questions I wanted to answer, or I was asking, couldn't be answered from within that philosophical viewpoint. So I thought, well, what's going on? And I basically taught myself by reading about other philosophies until I found something which seemed to fit. What we're going to do with you guys, and actually, Barbara, you've given me a great segue into moving forward, but also into talking about HARP in a little while, is what we're going to do is we're going to look at where you are now and see, does it make consistency and does it fit with who you are? Because the crucial thing, in my view, is that you're clear about your ontological views, your epistemological views, and your axiological views, and then you remain true to them and make sure they're consistent when you understand your research. And you will find that you will develop over time as you read more. So taking in those earlier questions, as you get different assumptions from literature, other knowledge, and you'll grow. Any other questions if they're quick, Sam? Because I'm mindful.
Yes, yeah, Mark, let me just be quick. There are 2 questions and then we can move on. So I'm going to read both to you, and then when you finish answering, you can move on. So okay. The first one is from John. Yeah. And John's question is, how can you be sure that the research philosophy you are adopting is the right one? That's the first question. And the second question is from Laddie. And Laddie's question is, having read so much, upon which benchmark do I determine my worldview?
They're both questions which are very similar. So how can you be sure it's the right one, and benchmark? Without giving too much away, in business and management, there is no one right philosophy. So you're not looking for the right philosophy. And if you think back to that earlier question, what does systematic mean? What you're looking for is consistency in your research design and your research philosophy. So it's so that it fits together and it's systematic. And so you can't benchmark it, but what you can do is you can see how people in the philosophy which you feel comfortable in are undertaking research, and look at what the accepted norms within that philosophical approach to things. So you can see, for example, in top American journals, there is a very clear accepted norm of how to write positivistic research up. When you move into more interpretivist research or critical realist research, there are not such prescribed accepted norms, but there's a clear way of how we do things, so how we report our data coding and so on. So you can actually see the ways of doing things so they fit together. Okay, hopefully that was enough to keep us moving forward. Do keep the questions coming. And it looks to me, Sam, that we may well be running a little bit late already, but what the heck, this is what's important for these guys. Folks,
Absolutely.
if anybody is feeling we're going too slowly and it's not of any use, put it in the chat and Sam will tell me that it's a load of rubbish and I'll speed up. If the timing's about right and you're getting stuff out of it, again, please do put that in the chat, because it's quite helpful to know we're going at about the right speed for you folks. Okay, we're going to move on. So the next form of assumptions that researchers make are called epistemological assumptions. And these are the ones which are about what constitutes valid, legitimate, acceptable knowledge. And we've already talked a fair bit about this in terms of organizations tend to like quantitative data and figures. But what this does for you as researchers is what you feel is important, what's valid to you, impacts on the data you collect, and then how you collect data and how you communicate this. And so what we're seeing here is the difference between collecting data on measurable facts versus stories and narratives, which are both legitimate, are both acceptable. Is one more so than other? Do you believe that statistics offer the ultimate truth, or do you believe that the opinions of individuals matter more? And for you, it's what to do your epistemological assumptions, how you feel about what counts as valid and legitimate data. What impact does that have on your research? Just so that you know, I actually feel that both are valid and both have a part to play. But then that's from my own pragmatist viewpoint. Then we have about our axiological value assumptions. These are about the role of our own values and ethics in the research process. I'm really fortunate in that now I can do research that I believe matters, and fortunately the university actually pays me to do it, which or an organisation do. I'm actually really keen at the moment on doing research which actually understands about why people trust and how trust operates in organisations, and also how, when there's been disputes and trust has been broken, and we've moved to areas of distrust, how can we move from distrust to neutral and rebuild trust in organisational relationships? I'm also very keen at the moment to looking at the impact that working online has on trust and distrust, and in particular how, as we're communicating at the moment, the fact that we're using these means, what impact does that have on our understanding, our abilities to be able to build trust? And so I've been looking recently at the United Nations moving to working online. What impact does that have on their ability to come to agreements and so on? It also determines how we personally become involved in the research process. Do we act as a researcher who is neutral and away from what's being researched, or are we actually part of what's being researched? So, for example, whose responsibility should career development be? Some people think that career development is the responsibility of the organisation. Others think it's the responsibility of the individual. Both could be considered to be equally right. It depends on your values. Another one, should companies pay a fair amount of tax or the legal requirement? So here we have the amount of tax paid by companies, some major name companies, just to illustrate that. And something which will make people really, really depressing. As a percentage, Amazon pays less tax as a proportion than I pay. Is that right? In fact, in the UK, Amazon paid less tax to the UK government than I paid. So one human being paid less tax than a company than Amazon with all those profits. Is that right? And that's about your axiological values. So we need to take, because that affects your assumptions on how you do your research. So let's actually try and summarize this. And this is a table which comes out of chapter 4 of the research methods book. Now, I'm referring to this chapter on purpose because what I got permission from the publisher was to put this up on my academia.edu webpage as a free download, so you can actually get the whole chapter for free. So I'm not selling anything, guys. You can have this for nothing, and it's there. But what we're actually seeing here is how, if you look at a continuum from being objective through to subjective along the top, how our ontological, our epistemological and axiological assumptions, whether objective or subjective, impact on the nature of methods. So if we tend to be objective, we're saying there's external, it's real, there's one true reality, and we're looking at things and we're trying to create order. We're interested in facts, numbers, observable phenomena, and we're researching it values free and we're detached. We tend to be more likely to go down quantitative methods. And that's what we're talking about. We're saying about things being systematic and fitting. So that goes back to the question that was asked by by John and also by Laddie, how they come together and be systematic. If we're actually more saying that that reality is decided by convention, it's socially constructed, there are multiple realities, and it's a flowing process, and when so much chaos, order is chaos, and what matters is I'm just looking to see if anyone's going to say anything, Sam. I'm sure they will in a minute. If you want to put it in the chat, Sam can just say it that way instead.
Can I talk, please? Shadrach.
Yes, good to Shadrach.
Yeah. So
yes, so I was going to say it matters because first of all, you need to be able to position your research in the area that you are seeking to enter is more or less inclined towards work also in that. So that comes in the context of the
research is really important, because what you want to do is to be able to be clear about how you want your research to be read. So if you explain to somebody that you're adopting an interpretivist approach, that immediately signals to the reader that you're going to be interested in telling in-depth stories. You're more likely to be using qualitative data, and it says read my research in this way, in the way I intend it to be read. So it's very helpful to do that. So there's positioning yourself to the reader, and it's also the positioning your research in relation to what others have done. So what you're showing there is, by explaining what my research philosophy is and talking about others, you can see the different insights that different philosophical approaches are likely to give. You then came on to talk about resolving conflict, Shadrach, which is a really interesting one. One of the issues when I was directing the doctoral program, which always worried me, was how many students, without questioning, adopted their supervisor's philosophical stance and did as they were told rather than actually being open to look at who they were. I think the crucial thing here is about being able to defend what you're doing and recognizing that business and management is what we call a pluralist subject in terms of philosophies. That means we have a variety of different ways of doing of looking at things, because we're a young subject and we borrow from across the social sciences. I think about resolving conflict is about being clear and being able to explain why you've done it the way you have and to justify it. So some really great points there, Shadrach. Do we have any other?
Yeah, I mean, Mark, we've got a couple of questions here. Do you mind if I read them out to you now?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Sam.
Okay, so the first one is from Milan. And Milan's question is, will your philosophy inform the type of research questions you ask as a researcher? That's the question from Milan. And then I'm going to, should I just read out all the questions and then I leave you to
and
answer?
Then we'll take those and then we'll move on again, okay? But read them out.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
And the next question is from Anthony.
Yep.
And his question, his question is, apart from the social sciences and humanities, can ontology, epistemology, and axiology be applicable to research philosophy in the physical sciences? That's Anthony's question.
Okay.
The third one is from Kesewa. Kesewa's question is, if philosophy is different, it could be challenging for them. So I think that's in relation to something you said.
Yeah.
And then the next one is from Peter. And the question is there anything as a value-free concept or assumption or judgment? That's from Peter.
Okay, that's great. Those are really great questions.
And then there's, there's one more.
Okay.
And that question is from Paul. And Paul's question is, what should inform the research philosophy? Should it be informed by the study's objectives or the researcher's own research philosophy?
Okay, some fantastic questions from the 5 people. So let's start with Anthony. Apart from social science and humanities, is research philosophy the physical sciences? Yes, it is. And if you look at the physical sciences, one of the ways we often refer to positivism, which is a research philosophy, is as a natural scientist doing experiments. So it's equally applicable. The difference is that they tend very often to be adopting a positivistic approach. So yes, it is equally applicable to all sciences because it's about the nature of knowledge and how we look at it. And the nature of knowledge is equally applicable to physical sciences as to social sciences and humanities. Right, then I'll just go to Cursor's one on if philosophy is different, it could be challenging. The answer to your question is a very simple one-word answer, yes, but that doesn't really help you much. So let's take it a little bit further. And what I would say is the most crucial thing is to get on well with your supervisor, and you can judge her or him better than I can. And if they say you do it this way and they have good justifications and you're happy with them, work with it. If it's the way they're suggesting in terms of research philosophies is so different to how you view the world, it may well be worth discussing that with them and coming to an amicable way forward, because otherwise you'll be having a horrible internal conflict between yourself and your PhD or your doctorate or your research, which won't work. With regard to can research be value free? Well, if you're a positivist, you believe it is, and we'll come on to that a bit more, so we'll talk about that more. And then the last ones were about your philosophy informing your research question, or should your research question inform your philosophy? And it depends on who you are. And can we leave that and come to it as we talk more about the philosophy? Because I think that will come to light a bit more as we move forward. Okay, let's carry on. Right. So there's a quick question. I'm just going to ask you to write down your answer to this. Imagine you're as part of your research, you discover workplace bullying in an international organization. Your axiology will primarily determine what? Which one of those? One of those answers is right. So axiology is about your, because we talked about it. So you could have noted down how you conceptualize, how you gather and communicate knowledge, becoming person involved, and it won't affect your research. I'm not going to ask for examples this time. I'm just mindful of the time, Sam. And when you get onto stuff which is interesting, it goes slower, but that doesn't matter because it's just fun. We don't get through some of the material so quick. That's fun though, fine though, because we're doing interesting stuff. And nobody's come up to you, Sam, yet and said, We're going too slowly, have they?
No, so one person wrote in the chat box and said that the pace was perfect. That was from Barbara.
Right, Barbara, you're the most wonderful human being I've ever met. Thank you so much. Big hugs. Right, carry on. Right, so you've probably written down an answer while we've been talking. Sam and I have been talking. So if you put down number 4, then basically you're wrong, because the axiology will affect how you do your research. Your own values and belief values and how you view ethical research will impact on how you do it. So if you got 4, you're wrong. The thing which axiology is about your values and whether you can believe you can keep apart from it. And so what we're looking at here is your axiology will affect the extent to which you let yourself become personally involved in helping your research participants. So you actually may be undertaking research on this Boolean, and as you get into it, you think, I've got to do something about this. That's your values coming in, and it's about part of who you are. So hopefully you're okay with that. Let's now move on. This one's an interesting one. Which one of the following statements is correct? Now, it depends. Each one of these depends. Management business researchers must not make any kinds of assumptions. Now, if you're a positivist, you might say that one was correct. So it depends on your philosophy. Managers and business researchers make either ontological or epistemological or axiological assumptions. Well, no, they make all of those assumptions. Ontological assumptions are more important than epistemological and axiological assumptions. All of them are important. And the last one, all management and business researchers make ontological, epistemological, blah, blah, blah assumptions, but they may not, or may not be aware. That is the best answer in there, but you might answer number 1 if you're a positivist. But the best answer of all is number 4 on there, because everybody's making these assumptions. We need to be, but they just may not realize you'll be doing it. So what does this mean for us? Here we have a picture of you. It can't be of me because it's got hair. So the epistemology, what are your assumptions about knowledge? What do you think of the role of values, your axiology? And then your gut, what are your assumptions about reality? So your mind or your brain, what the assumptions of knowledge, your heart, your values, and your gut feeling, the assumptions of reality. So that basically summarizes that. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit of a speed up now, because I'm minded that we're at 20 past and I want to get a little bit further along. So what I'm going to say is I'm just going to ask a very quick question. Is there one best research philosophy? Turn your microphone on and answer.
No, there isn't any one best research philosophy.
Okay, no. And either you or somebody else, let's have some reasons as to why that is.
The different philosophies give us different perspectives. So it's almost like you're seeing a picture and looking at different parts of the picture. So they all bring together different perspectives, which make our knowledge more in-depth or more full.
Okay, that's interesting. So we can look at, if we bring them together, do we get some of the parts? If you add all the parts together, we get something bigger than the individual parts. The whole is bigger than individual parts. So that's another part that could be. But also there's also the aspect that in the business and management as a social science, it has grown by adopting a variety of philosophies, and different people have different views on this. And what we're really looking at here is where we work in what's called a pluralist discipline. So it's a discipline which recognizes that there are a variety of approaches, and as the previous speaker just said, each of these has value. At the same time, within that, for us as individuals, whilst we may recognize that each of these approaches has value, so each different philosophical approaches have value, we would probably also have certain ones which we feel happier with, ones which fit in more with who we are. If you think of the picture on the left, they fit in not only with our mind, but with our heart and our gut. And so invariably there will be a certain ones which we feel happy with, or in particular which we will tend to adopt when we undertake our own research. And this can be summarized by looking at management and business research as a what's called a chimera. And that's a mythical beast which brought together, as you can see, a lion and various other animals together. And so if we take those ideas, what we can say is that we're a newcomer, and we're sort of stuck between, we have the positivistic science view of doing things a certain way, having that sort of authority, and also wanting to give a contribution which comes more from the arts and the moralistic aspects of things. And so we vacillate between being political between philosophies and what makes sense, and there will be ongoing battles into which philosophies are right for us. Now let's get on and do some interesting stuff about your philosophies. As preparation, Sam, we got everybody, didn't we, to have a go at doing harp? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And we're working on the assumption, folks, that you've all had a go at doing this. Yes. This is normally when you've got a class of students, you say, how many of you have done this? And everybody looks very sheepish and looks the other way. But I don't think we're going to have a problem with you guys because you're at the doctoral level. So what Hart was, a good colleague of mine, Alexandra Bristow, and I, we developed this questionnaire to actually start to ask you about your own beliefs and map them against the major philosophies. And it's not a personality test. It's to start exploring your own research philosophies. And it's about you where you are now. And going back to some of the early questions, this is about our research journeys. And so this is you at a particular point in time, and it's going to change as we move forward looking at our research philosophies. And so what we've done is we've actually put you into groups. And so the IT guys should be able to press some buttons and things should happen now. And the time now is my watch is about 22 minutes past. And what I'd like you in your groups, and so it's going to, is do you have, forget the word both, do you have a clear fit with one research philosophy? Or do you have different, or do you have more than one? Which philosophy do you disagree with the most? And in your group, are they the same or different philosophies? And what implications do you think this has? So what we're looking at is everybody got the same philosophy or are there differences? Do people have more than one philosophy?
Maybe.
And do people disagree? And what we're going to do is we'll put you into your groups, and if you come back from your groups back into your group chats back into the main room, and if we say come back at past the hour, so that'll give you 6 minutes just to quickly talk through these and bounce some ideas about. Okay. Right, so if whoever does the groupie bits, can they do that? And I'll just wait.
Yeah, so the IT is just going to put everyone into groups now.
Okay,
cool.
so it should have come up on people's screen. The host is inviting you to join breakout room number, and so when it does, join the breakout room and have a look at those questions. Okay. In all honesty, it's quite nice to actually see some human beings rather than talking to a blank screen, and especially as there's quite a few people smiling. So what I'd like to just first of all ask, I mean, from what I can gather, there was somewhere between 4 and 10 groups operating. It was very difficult to see because I couldn't actually get in to see anything. But so can somebody from one of the groups just, first of all, when people were doing that, did everybody come up with the same philosophy or did you have different philosophies in the groups? Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
What we see here, first of all, for all is there are a variety of research philosophies that people have, and that is what you would expect within our discipline. People do have a variety, and that's as it is. We also see that people are not necessarily, I am definitely a something or something, I'm not definitely interpretivist, I'm not definitely postmodernist, but people tend to have leanings towards a particular one more than others. And again, that is normal, and you would expect so. Very few people are well-defined something or something else. The only one where people tend to be clearly one rather than the others is if people are a positivist, and that was coming through from the interpretation. But even there may be occasions where that isn't the case. Where you did see people being more than one, you tended to, quite often there were people who were being a pragmatist and say an interpretivist, or a pragmatist and a critical realist. And that's because pragmatism tends to bend and adopt what makes the most sense. And we'll talk a bit more about what a pragmatist feels like and what they believe in a few minutes. The important thing is that this has done, and it came through from some interpretation, it has allowed you to surface what your assumptions actually are rather than following a particular way of doing research because that's the way you've been taught to do it. So this is about you thinking about how do you look at the world and then following through and how is this going to impact, or how could this impact on the way you do your research. Where it can become problematic is if you look at the world one way and you're expected to do the research in a very, very different way. And the reason that's problematic is it causes cognitive dissonance. You don't feel comfortable in what you're doing. The other thing which has already been raised by people is where this may be problematic is if you have a supervisor who says you must do it one way and that doesn't fit with the way you look at the world. And there it's about talking it through with your supervisor. And I always say to students when I'm working with them that if your supervisor says something and I say something else, your supervisor's right and I'm wrong. And so the last thing I hope any of you do is go to your supervisor and say, I was in a session which Sam organised and Mark said this and Mark must be right, so you're wrong, supervisor, because that's likely to upset them and make them very, very angry. So please be a bit more subtle and say, I've had these alternate views, can we talk them through, or something like that. Learn how to manage your supervisor in a subtle and caring manner. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at this in a bit more detail. Sam, I'm mindful that the timing's gone completely and utterly to rubbish now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on for a while. You had a sort of a break there. Mm-hmm. And then what we'll do is when we get to the end of the bit of philosophies, we'll then have a 15-minute break and go on into the next bit. Yeah. As I say, folks, these things happen, and working with you guys, it's almost inevitable because we're working with doctoral students. So okay. Let me just go back to sharing screens and then we should be back to run. And again, Sam, if you can keep your microphone on when we're sharing and bring the question. Okay. Right.
Okay. That's a really lovely desktop background you've got, Mark.
Oh, it's just the one that Windows for Mac provides. It's nothing. Hang on, let's move that out of the way. Let's come to okay. Here we go. And we should be coming. Okay, have you got the screen back? Yep.
Yeah, it's right. Back on screen.
So what you've been looking at is basically 5 major philosophies which tend to be used in business and management research. And the way I find tends to be easy to remember them is to use these analogies. So think of a positivist as a scientist in a laboratory, a critical realist as an archaeologist, bringing together lots of different information from the past and trying to put it together, a interpretivist as a artist sculpting what she or he sees from other people's views, The postmodernists, the critical activist, perhaps Black Lives Matter would be the obvious one to have there as a now as a political activist, and actually somebody's doing something which is crucial to our futures in the world. And then the pragmatist as an architect, designing, and so using research to actually answer questions that matter. The most important thing being the design or answering research. What we're going to do, whoever is that is just turn the funny noise off, is we're going to actually start off by looking at positivists. And this is, these are people who see research as being natural scientists. So in ontological terms, they would see management and organizations are real, just like physical objects are real. And as a researcher, we don't influence them by how we feel. And there's fixed structures and it's very granular. You can see exactly what's going on. From an epistemological point of view, we're trying to discover that one truth through observable and measurable facts. We're looking for cause and effect relationships, and from that we're generating laws, rules and generalizations. And we're value 3 as research in axiological terms, and we can be objective. And not surprisingly, when you see all that, we tend to use, this tends to lead towards using quantitative methods with very structured, so questionnaire type collection of data, or using existing data that's already been collected, structured observations, and then large samples and measuring things. And we might visualize positivism as something like Newton's clockwork orange. So, or here we see, and from the 19th and 18th centuries, how they believed the world could be seen as a clockwork universe on the left-hand side. So you could actually measure it and behave, and it's governed by laws. It's very much what positives say. Everything's governed by laws you can predict. And you can take that to its actual extreme of actually being able to produce machines and apply and actually create mechanical objects. So here we have a clockwork duck created in the 1790s, 1739. And so what's happened here is you've, like positives would say, well, you can actually, the whole world is like a machine, and you can, and it operates almost like clockwork. And in this clockwork duck, the idea was you could feed it and it would actually create some poo coming out the other end. So you can actually see that little arrow where the bottom is. So it's about taking a mechanistic view of organizations. And this, in all honesty, is one of the dominant perspectives in which research still operates.
Yeah, Mark, sorry. There's a quick question, if you don't mind me asking you. There's a quick question. So it's from Patience. And her question is, what is the difference between positivism and post-positivism?
Right. Post-positivism has taken positivism and said, okay, but let's look at the realities of the worlds we're living in and actually recognizing that will impact upon it. So it's actually adding, probably close to say, some ideas of critical realism into it and saying that there's context more. Probably the best thing, Patience, is to go into a bit more detail on this independently rather than spend time now, though. Okay. Right.
Yeah,
so
thanks.
So positivist is very much the research with gloved hand, and I think this is quite an interesting analogy in COVID times. So you don't actually impact on the research, and like when we wear gloves at the moment in COVID terms, it doesn't impact upon us. We can move to the idea of critical realists. Researchers are archaeologists now. So we're saying, like with the positive, management and organizations are real things, but we're saying now they're not like physical objects. They have different structures and layers and very much more nuanced. And what we're saying is that we can't always see immediately the underlying causal mechanisms of what's happening, which impact what we do see on the surface. So they're saying it's like layers, you know, like an archaeologist goes down through layers to discover what happened in the past and how that impacts on what's happening now. We're saying we need to excavate down to discover these underlying causal mechanisms. And so in doing that, as critical realists, we're actually trying to go through the facts and look at things in terms of historically as what the facts were, the stories that people have, and generate causal explanations of things. Within this, we will recognise that there are values coming through, and research is value laden, and different people will see things in different ways. One fantastic example of that, which I've just been reading, is a book called Black Emu, which is looking at Australia and using the accounts made by the white settlers of Australia about how they saw the way the indigenous Aboriginal peoples actually looked after the land, and reanalyzing that data. And what they've discovered is that rather than being nomadic peoples and as defined at the time as primitive, they're actually incredibly advanced and had learnt how to husband and look after a very fragile ecosystem and actually enable it to produce sufficient crops and support sufficient animals for them to live well. And so what had happened was that the values that the original explorers had placed on that data led them to interpret that these people as being nomadic and actually not being very advanced. When we reinterpret the same data from a modern day with, but perhaps I would hope, better understanding, we actually see that these people were incredibly advanced in knowing how to husband and look after the land and to be able to survive. So the idea of research being value laden. But what I think is very important, these ideas of how the values of the research impacts on what's actually being said. And then, so we're looking at methods of in-depth historical analysis, and also analysis of social structures and organizational structures, and crucially using a variety of methods and data. If we take critical realism a bit further, we actually, what we're really saying is it depends on how you look at things. So if we take this diagram here, we actually have two squares, A and B, and the question I would ask you is, are they of different colors? And your answer will probably be initially yes, but look, they're actually the same color. It's just the visualization, the way it's been visualized, that actually enables that to happen. If we take another example here, which I think will bring it home quite well, what I'd like you to do here is, I'd like you to listen to this video. Oh, hang on just a minute. Let's go back to the right place. Forward. I'd like you to watch this video, and I'd like you to just note down any of the music artists you might recognize, okay? Oh, Jesus. Right, so let's actually get this to go, and it should hopefully work on the sound as well.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce some members of my group to you before we go any further. On backing vocals, the Sugar Babes. The man with the beautiful voice, Mr. Marvin Gaye. On the lead guitar is Jimmy Page. On the rhythm guitar, Noel Gallagher. And on the drums, Keith Moon. On bass, guitar, Cheryl Crow. Finally, on piano, legendary Stevie Wonder. Please, Stevie.
Okay, folks. So, first of all, Sam, did the sound come through okay?
Well, it came through okay here at my end, yes.
Excellent. So, folks, first of all, how many, let's have a look at these artists. So the people who are coming on there, you probably got some of them at least, were Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was supposedly playing with the Sugar Babes, Marvin Gaye, Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, Noel Gallagher from Oasis, Keith Moon from The Who, Sheryl Crow and Stevie Wonder. And as a realist, you would say, I've seen it, therefore it is. As a critical realist, so you'd actually start to say, hang on, I don't actually think that's possible. For example, I know that Elvis Presley died in 1977, and I know that Oasis as a band with Noel Gallagher wasn't actually around until the 2000s. So something. I also know that Keith Moon's dead as well. So how could he be playing in a concert? So let's have a look and put some more data into this. Is it accurate? Well, that's where the shots are at. The films are actually from. So one from one of Elvis's concerts, and you can see the various things here. And here's when they were actually filmed. So what if you were looking at this as a critical realist? What you would actually be saying is, yes, I can see this, but it doesn't make sense. And you'd be bringing in information you already had, or information that you actually went out and collected subsequently, to actually look at what you were seeing and to interpret it more fully. It's a bit like as you walk down the street and you sometimes see these pavement artists who've done these amazing drawings on pavements, and some of them are things like you can actually see steps supposedly going down into the pavement. Now, you know, in reality, they don't exist because you can say this is a drawing on a pavement because you can see somebody's a piece of chalk. But so you're bringing external or additional information to understand what's happening. That's what a critical realist is. They're critical about what they see and they interpret it in the light of other knowledge. So we've now looked at critical realists. Let's now go. I don't want to anymore. Right. So if we look at realism in a bit more, I mean, what we're saying is critical realism takes into account different layers of reality and recognizes the differences between physical reality, and we see on the left, and social reality, the fact of culture, relationships, and so on. And what it recognizes is that some rules we can actually defy and some are not so changeable. So it's very difficult to be able to defy the laws of gravity, but laws of marriage are socially constructed and they change between different countries and they can be altered. And if you can move to one country, it doesn't be subject to different rules. So that's a social reality rather than a physical fact like gravity. And what we would argue is much of organizational reality is about social facts, which are not set in stone and they change and are based on interpretation. If we look at interpretivists are moving towards a more artistic or actor type approach to research. So they would view in ontological terms organizations and as managing and organizing. So it's a flux and of processes and experiences. It's complex and most importantly, it's socially constructed through our culture and our language. In a minute, we'll have a short little question to actually try and understand that better. And so we're saying there are multiple meanings and multiple interpretations of realities. And so what one person sees as a reality may be very different from what somebody else sees. An example of that is I quite often with my students, I get them to look out the window and write a note of what they see. And they all look out of the same classroom window, but they all interpret that reality that they see out of the window slightly differently. There are some consistencies and constants between them, but their interpretations are all slightly different. Epistemology for interpretivists, they make meaning through looking at how people tell stories, people's narratives about what they see, their perceptions and interpretations. And from this, they try and build new understandings and new world views of what's happening. So they're saying that research is very much value bound. And as researchers, our values will invariably be impacted upon by what we research, and we will impact upon our research. And as we're empathetic and show this in our research, it's invariable that that's going to impact back on what we're researching. And our interpretations are key in what we contribute. And not surprisingly, given this focus on understanding and experiences, it tends to move towards small samples and qualitative methods and in-depth investigations, interpretations. So what we're seeing in relation to that earlier question now is we're seeing how the philosophical approach you adopt does have an impact upon the methods, but they're not exact. This approach equals this method. It's a much more fluid type relationship. So Just a quick question. How many fingers do you have? Write it down. Okay. So, anybody want to say how many fingers they've got? Go on, Sam, you can do this. How many fingers have you got?
Is that a trick question? I've got 10.
10 fingers.
Sam's got 10 fingers.
Yeah, I've got 10. 10.
Sam, has anybody got a different number of fingers to Sam?
No. 10 fingers.
Ah, I've got a
Someone
different.
says 8.
I've got a different number to Sam. I've got 8.
8.
Yeah.
I got 12.
You've got 12.
Yes. The other one is a thumbs, so it's 8.
8, yes.
Yeah. Right. This is exactly what I thought would happen. Now, what we're saying here is, for interpretivists, even hard physical realities are socially constructed. So it's a pretty strong physical reality of how many fingers or thumbs or things we've got sticking out of our palm of our hand, isn't it? It's there and you can touch it and feel it. But the way we interpret it is different. I mean, Sam had 10, so Sam was not distinguishing between fingers and thumbs.
Yep.
In fact, it may well be conceptually for you, Sam, there is no such thing as a thumb. Everything's a finger. So he had 10. Others of us, like myself and a few other colleagues, we said, we've got 8 fingers and 2 thumbs. And that's typical in the UK. In Germany, and indeed in South Africa for Sam, and in Greece and Russia, they don't distinguish between fingers and thumbs at all, so they've got 10. However, if you go to others, and this is where Greece and Russia come in, sorry, I got that wrong. In Greece and Russia, they don't distinguish between toes or fingers or thumbs. They're all fingers. So if you ask a Greek or a Russian, they're going to say they've got 20. So what we're trying to see here, which is a crucial part of interpretivism, is that hard realities are physically constructed, and the physical world is very much mediated by our use of language. So, it's not saying that some people have more fingers because they've grown an extra finger. It's saying it's the language and is how we mediate the physical world. So it's a really important thing. And interpretists say that even physical realities are reconstructed by our use of language. Okay. Let's just have another one of this and see how this comes out. Another little question for you. How many planets does the solar system have? Let's see.
Yeah.
7 or 8, yeah, exactly. I heard. Thank you for that, saying that.
8.
Or it could be. It's even more complex than that, though. The issue relates around to this picture, which is of Pluto, and in 2005, Pluto was one of 9 planets, and then they did, but there were other objects being discovered larger than Pluto, which would not be include planets, and so. What they decided was they were going to have a new code, and Pluto is no longer going to be a planet. It was going to be a dwarf planet, and they put other ones in. So the solar system has now gone from 11 down to 8. So in effect, what's happening here, a hard physical reality has been reconstructed through language and social consensus, or indeed lack of it, because some people still believe Pluto is a planet. And think about it, this is what happens quite a lot of the time in the organizational world, in that things get repackaged and given different names and talked about in a different way. And so we can look at, in financial crisis, of how did they repackage subprime mortgages? We can look at coronavirus and how parts of America, i.e. Donald Trump, have been trying to repackage it not as a virus but as a Chinese plague and things like that. We repackage it, and that's interpretism is all about, this use of language and how we use the language to describe and explain and interpret the real world. And then finally we move to postmodernists, and these are researchers as political activists is a quite nice way of visualizing this. So, and what the key issue here is about organizations being constructed through power relationships. And what's as important as the way people say things is what people don't say. So silence is an important. It's people who are skeptics. They question the truth. It's about revolutionaries. They say, let's look at things in a very different way. And what they're trying to do is to expose power relationships and question dominant views. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement, other than being absolutely crucial to our futures, is a really good way of a postmodern exposing power relationships and showing how truth is a product of ideology and how the way the world is constructed negatively affects certain groups of people. And within this, we're very often focusing on absences, silences, and the repression of meanings and of certain groups' voices. Within this, people's values are really, really important. So as a researcher, your own values are crucial. And there's a recognition that you as a researcher are working with and embedded within these power relationships which you're looking at and quite often trying to critique. And you're reflexive, so you recognize your impact on what you're researching, and then how what you're researching impacts back on you. It tends to be using qualitative methods, and it tends to be very much in-depth investigations and the search for the hidden voice and the hidden perspectives. So again, a different viewpoint. So you're reflecting back. I just thought that was a beautiful pitch to give this idea of searching for the hidden needs and looking at something, then looking back on yourself and what impact that's had on you and what impact you're having on what you're researching. The final one I wanted to actually. Sorry, is there a question there, Sam?
No, Mark, it's someone who was talking.
Okay, right, sorry. Yeah, and we're looking at is pragmatists. The visual image here is a researcher and architect. And so the idea in terms of ontology is that it's still about process and managing and organizing, and we're looking at the complex realities of what's happening. But the crucial thing here in ontological things is the practical implications of research. So we're doing research which has practical implications, and we're trying to find methods that fit to that research problem. So we're looking in terms of looking for practical meanings in epistemological terms and trying to undertake research which will enable successful action, normally to improve and to solve problems. So it's very much an epistemological focus on practical relevance and utility. And so within this, what you're researching is what you believe to be important. So your beliefs and also your doubts, when you think, hang on, what's going on here? This doesn't make sense. And again, you're recognizing you have an impact on the research and the research has an impact on you, but it's driven by your values in terms of what you intend to research. Methodologically, it's about which method makes the most sense to answer the particular question. And by method, I mean method or methods. And so quite often you'll be doing mixed or multiple method research or action research, but it could be anything. And the real focus is to develop practical solutions or outcomes in terms of the research. Through these 5 main research philosophies that are used in management, other ones like postmodern, post-positivism and so on, but at least hopefully that gives you an overview. So let's just have a couple of quick questions just to check a bit of understanding, and then any questions from you, and then we will take that well-earned break, albeit a little bit later than we were going to. So the first quick check question. Jane wants to challenge conventional thinking about the banking industry by examining what junior bankers write and don't write about their jobs in social media. Jane is least likely to be a... What do you reckon, guys? You've got a 1 in 4 chance of being right.
Positivist.
Yay! Whoever said positive. Who shouted out positivist? You have the golden star for this morning.
Oh, thank you.
All right. You can put it on your lapel and walk around it and be really happy about life.
Okay.
What she's most likely to be is a postmodernist. She's likely to be challenging things and she's interested in the silences, what people leave out, what they don't write. So it's likely she's a postmodernist. But you're right, she's least likely to be a positivist. And then the last one before any questions and the break, Jeannie uses mixed methods to find a solution to a staff turnover in the hospitality industry. She is most likely to be a
Pragmatist.
Well, there's quite a few extra gold stars going around there. She's most likely to be a pragmatist, and the clue there is about the using mixed methods, and she's finding a solution. So that fits in there. Before we take a break up until past to let everybody have comfort breaks, get some liquid and other things, do we have any questions that need sorting out on the chat?
Yeah, I mean, Mark, we've got about 4. I don't know if you want to take them quickly before we go.
I think so, because then it gives us
all right.
And then we can sort of, what I'll say, folks, is if you want to listen to the questions, do. If you want to take your break, do. Start it now. But we will be back on stream and chatting away and bouncing around the world of research strategies at past the hour.
Yeah, correct. Okay, so let me read them out to you quickly. So the first one is from Joshua. And Joshua's question is research philosophy the same as research paradigm? So that's the first question from Joshua. Is research philosophy the same as research paradigm?
Okay.
Okay. And then the next one is from Tony.
Yep.
And Tony's question is, what is the difference between critical realism and critical theory? That's Tony's question. That's the second one. And then the next one, the third one, is from Duke. And Duke's question is, my literature has led me to an initial interviews to be conducted on my sample size before moving to the quantitative side of my study. Can this be a critical realism philosophy?
So can a quantitative study be critical realist? Yes.
Yeah. And then the next one after that is can one mix? So that's from Given. And Given's question is, can one mix interpretivism and pragmatism?
Righty-ho, there's some really great questions there.
Yeah, Mark, sorry, there's one more that just came in from Lulu.
Well done, Lulu, you sneaked in just at the end.
So Lulu's question is, I think it's Jenny uses mono methods.
Yep.
But the research is looking for a practical solution. Is she still a pragmatist?
No, Jenny uses. If she was.
So what if? Yeah. So it's what if Jenny uses mono methods, but the research is looking for practical solution? Is she still a pragmatist?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I've got those. That's really good.
Okay.
So let's start off with Joshua. Is a research philosophy a paradigm? Not quite, Joshua. Paradigm is a broader term for granted assumptions which underwrite the frame of reference to which you undertake your research. So it may well have aspects of the research philosophy in it, but it's likely to be broad. It's likely to be broader than just a research philosophy. It will have other things coming in as well. So it's a set of basic taken for granted assumptions which underwrite your frame of reference, your way of working, how you theorize, and how you operate. So it's broader. Then Tony was about critical realism and theory, wasn't it? What was the exact part with Tony's one, Sam? Critical realism and theory. Sorry, Sam, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Let me just go back to Tony's question now.
Yeah.
I'm scrolling up. Sorry, Mark, can you just maybe move on to the next one while I'm looking at this?
Okay, let's go. Duke, can a quantitative study be a critical realist study? The answer is yes, it can be, because it's but the likelihood is that a critical realist study, which is a quantitative study, you know, when you do these quantitative studies on the questionnaire, you have things which and you say, if you're willing to help further, please write your details here. And then what you're doing is you're then using that to further understand what the response has been. So then the critical realist part comes in. So you can have quantitative as part of the critical realist study. That's absolutely not problematic whatsoever. It's likely though there will be other parts to it as well. Given can you be some interpretivist and pragmatist at the same time? I think was really what you're getting at there. And the answer is, with a pragmatist, the key thing with the pragmatism is that you're actually choosing the research methods and the research approach that best enables you to find the solution and to answer your question. So what may well happen is that you may well, as a pragmatist, be adopting a lot of the views and the understandings that an interpretivist uses for a particular research question, to answer a particular research question. The world view will still be that of the pragmatist. It's just that some of the methods you use may well move towards the interpretivist thing, because the crucial thing is about the most appropriate method or methods to find the solution. So it's a focus on the solution and the utility with the pragmatism. So you may well adopt very similar methods, but you'll be doing it from a pragmatic point of view rather than an interpretivist point of view. Lulu, looking at that Jenny one that's still up on the screen, if Jenny had used a mono method to find the solution, if that was the most useful and most appropriate way to finding the solution, she could still be a pragmatist using mono methods. Pragmatists do tend to use mixed methods, but you don't have to be using mixed methods to be a pragmatist. And now we can go back to Tony's question, which hopefully you've got there now, Sam.
Yeah, so I mean, there was one, initially by Duke, which was on the critical realism philosophy. Have you looked at that one already?
Yes, I've done that one.
Okay, you've done that one.
It was Tony's one on the critical realism theory.
Okay, so I'm just trying to. Okay, so Tony's question was, what is the difference between critical realism and critical theory?
Right. Critical realism is the philosophical approach to how where you take is where you look at it and you question. The whole point of both these is the word critical, and the word critical, it means we're actually looking at what we see and bringing other information and knowledge to bear on it in order to critique it and better understand it. So with critical realism, we're taking a realist perspective or realist philosophy and bringing the other knowledge, understanding to critique what we see from a realist perspective. So we're becoming critical of it. With critical theory, what we're doing is we're taking the theory and saying, and doing exactly the same, bringing other information to look at that particular theory and say, hang on, does this make sense because, and so we're critiquing it. So we're being critical. So we're bringing other knowledge in to better understand and critique. So they're different things completely. But the critical aspect is similar ideas on both. Okay, did anything else pop up in the chat while we were talking, Sam?
No, that's about it. Thanks.
That's a real gift from everybody. Thank you, folks. What we'll say is it's now 20 past by my watch, so we'll resume at 30:30, which will give everybody a chance to have a bit of a comfort break and so on. And when we resume, we'll look at research approaches and strategies. Okay?
Yeah, correct. Okay.
Great stuff. Thanks very much.
Cool. So see you at 30:30 then.
Yeah, 30:30. Yeah, indeed. Okay. So we're all back. Okay for the screen, Sam?
Yeah, it's back on now.
So what we're looking at,
thank you.
Great. So what we're looking at now, folks, is we're moving on and looking at the approaches and strategies. So in particular, what we're doing on the onion here is we're looking at the ideas of experiment, survey, archival research, case study, ethnography, and so on. and how they actually relate back to philosophies, but also how they start to relate to our data collection methods. So we're starting to see the interrelationships. So if you were looking at this diagram, you may remember as a child having those little circles where you could move different concentric circles around. They were held together by a paper clip in the middle. So we're rotating each of these layers of the onion, or each of these circles around, to actually make sure that the research philosophy is aligned with the approach to theory development, our methodological choice, and then our research strategy, and then going right through to the data collection methods, recognizing that we can use a variety of different data collection methods within each research philosophy. So in terms of the research strategies, what we have there is the experiment, where we're actually studying, looking at change and seeing what happens when you effect a change on one variable from another variable. It normally involves having a control group and then manipulating an independent variable. We'll be looking at surveys, which is structured collection of data from a sizable population, often using data collection questionnaires. But I think it's important to remember when we talk about surveys, that surveys are more than just questionnaires. It can include other techniques for collecting large amounts of data. You could have a structured observation, or you could have structured interviews. Those are also forms of surveys like a questionnaire is. We're looking at archival research, so analyzes and uses administrative records and documents as a principal data source. And these are really important because they're produced through day-to-day activities, and they show how people were actually looking at and responding to that. If you think of newspapers, they report day-to-day activities, but they do have the bias or the views of the editor for the context as well as the immediate context. We're looking at grounded theory methodology, where we actually develop theory from the data from a series of data points and build up the theory inductively. And we'll also look a little about narrative inquiry. So we use people's narratives to actually reconstruct their experiences. So that's what we're going to look at. But rather than just sort of look at them in abstract, let's actually look at them in terms of examples of what people are doing. So here's the first one to look at. And we've got somebody called Chloe, and Chloe's got access to a national chain of retailers to collect data for research on relationship between employee treatment and trust. So basically how the employees are treated and whether or not they trust their employer. As part of her research, she gets over 300 store employees to complete a questionnaire. The test asks the respondents to indicate their level of agreement with 50 statements, such as you have a statement, strongly agree, agree, neither agree or disagree, disagree, and then strongly disagree. So what I'd like you to think about is what sort of data is this sort of research generating? And then from that very brief overview of the research strategy, again, what sort of strategy has Chloe adopted, or strategies? What's her methodological choice? And then what's her philosophy as well? So does anybody want to actually start off with the sorts of data that Chloe's collecting? Either put it in the chat and Sam can read it out, or unmute yourself and let me know. There's a stunning silence there.
Quantitative.
There's actually something in the chat box. Shadrach says quantitative.
Thank you, Shadrach. Indeed, it is quantitative data, and it's quantitative data where we're looking at the level of agreement and disagreement, and what you can do from that is you can get an overall score, and it's data that will be coded numerically. You can see that from the questionnaire where you've got a little 5 next to strongly agree, a 4 next to agree, and so on. As an aside, we have to be careful with when we sort of use these data, because what we have to be careful. We've really got an ordinal scale going from strongly agree through to strongly disagree, and yet we've given a coding which says that responding agree is twice what the code for disagree. So it may be that those codes are not the most appropriate in terms of the form of analysis we're doing. So we need to think carefully about that. It may be better, for example, to code it with strongly agree as 2, agree as 1, neither as 0, disagree as -1, and strongly disagree as -2. But anyway, and then with these data and coded numerically, we can actually undertake some statistical analysis. For example, we could rank responses, and we'll analyze it quantitatively. So what's the strategy that Chloe's adopted? If she's using a questionnaire, what's that likely to be? Come on, guys, we've got.
So, so 3 responses in the chat box: survey, survey, survey. Great.
I was just about to say, guys, we've got 117 great minds in the participant box here, and realistically, we ought to be able to get this with 117 great minds. We ought to get that one, a survey strategy. You're right. And a methodological choice is using a mono method, and it's a mono method quantitative. But let's take it a stage further. And what research philosophy do you think Chloe has adopted here? You should be able to do that now, guys. Put it in the chat box if you want, so you don't have to identify yourself. So
that's positivism.
Yay! Well done. That was Caroline, wasn't it? Yeah, well done, Caroline. That's fantastic. So, you're welcome. What you're seeing, folks, is you can do this. So let's have another one. This is another one which is very, very different. So as part of a research strategy to answer the question, and how and why do employees' career aspirations differ between gender, Sven asks 30 participants in one company to write a short paragraph titled, "Where do I see myself in 10 years' time?" Now, I'm not going to ask you to do the exercise in blue because we're running so far behind time. But what I'd like you to do is imagine you've done that exercise. You've drafted your short paragraph. And again, what sort of data is this going to generate?
So qualitative data.
Okay, and it's qualitative data, and we can take, and it's going to be qualitative textual data, isn't it? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, and this next question: what research strategy has Sven adopted?
Case study.
Unstructured interview.
Ah, right. Somebody said case study, and somebody said interview. Now we need to be careful here. What we've actually got is interview is not a research strategy. It's certainly, there's something going on here. Whether or not it's an interview, we can come to in a minute. But it could be a case. It could be a case study because he's working with people in one company. So case study makes good sense there. So we could say, yeah, he's doing a case study of one organization here. So, and then somebody that said interview. Well, it could be an interview where what he's doing is he's doing an interview and he's actually preparing people by asking them to actually write this as part within the interview. So yeah, it could be done as an interview as a data collection method. It could be part of a diary collection method. We don't have enough information to know yet, but certainly interview is one. His methodological choice is and what search philosophy do you think Sven's adopting here?
Interpretivist.
It could be interpretive. Somebody said critical realist and then went critical and then went quiet. It could be a critical realist as well. At the moment, we don't have enough information to know, but it's certainly in that sort of area because we don't know which it's going to be. But it's either an interpretivist or a critical realist, almost certainly within there. Okay, so let's just move along. And here is the third one. Sorry, what did somebody? I didn't quite catch that. Can you say that again, please? Okay, never mind then. Here's the third
Can you
one.
please?
So, right. Here's the third one. What is the research strategy here? Mark has two research questions. Are trust and distrust judgments symmetrical or simultaneous? Do trust and distrust judgments entail the same or different expectations? He decides to ask 60 participants in 2 organizations to rank 60 cards containing the emotions they might feel in relation to change. After participants have answered these questions, he asks them to explain why. And just as a bit of background, these emotions that they rank include the word trust and the word distrust. Describe the data these questions will generate again. What research strategy or strategy has he adopted? And what is his methodological choice? So first of all, the data that's going to generate.
Quantitative and qualitative.
Yep, it's going to generate both quantitative and qualitative data. The quantitative data is going to come out of ranking the cards, and the qualitative data will be from the questioning of them in as to explaining why they've ranked them in the order they have. Yeah. And then the research strategy that's been adopted here. You can actually get the research from the information you've got here. Yes, you were pretty much right there. And finally, what's the research philosophy that's going on here?
Pragmatism.
It's when it's mixed methods, we know it's either going to, it's pretty certain it's going to be either critical realism or pragmatism. And this one actually was done as was a pragmatic piece of work, but it depends on how it's going to be used and what the crucial focus is. But yet you're right there as well. So what you're seeing here is the link between the method and the research strategy and the philosophy. So you see how they're all interrelated, folks? But we do actually start to see some patterns. So let's actually start to look at that in summary. So, and what I've done in here is I've actually introduced an extra part to it. I've introduced this idea of deductive. So positivist research tends to be deductive. So that means it's about starting with a theory and collecting data to test it. It tends to use quantitative data, and it tends to use either experiments. So you have a control group and then you look at the impact of change in the variable, or it uses surveys. Okay. Interpretivist research tends to be inductive. Hang on a sec. So what that means is you tend to start with data and induce theory from the data. So you're building theory out of data rather than theory testing. And it tends to use qualitative data more, and that's either in the case study, grounded theory, or in ethnographic approaches. So we have different research strategies coming through there. Critical realism tends to be abductive. Now, abductive research is research which can either start as an inductive piece or a deductive piece. So it can either start as theory building inductively, so you're starting with data and generating a theory, or it can start as deductive research where you've already got a theory and you're testing it. And what happens is, as you're doing your theory building or theory testing, you come across a surprising fact, something you weren't expecting, and that causes you to go out and collect more data. So you're moving backwards and forwards between induction and deduction. In terms of methods, it can use qualitative and or quantitative, and it tends to be things like archival research, surveys, although you can also have interviews and so on. Sorry, in terms of strategies, it tends to be archival research and surveys in the main. Although you can, of course, have it within a case study organisation as well, so it becomes more complex. Postmodernism is abductive as well, and it's mainly qualitative research, but it can use pretty much, other than survey strategy, any in combination. And pragmatist research, again, it tends to be abductive, can use quantitative and or qualitative data, and it uses any in any combination whatsoever in terms of the research strategies. So hopefully now you're seeing the relationship between these. Do we have any questions, folks?
Yeah, Mark,
yes.
There are about 3 questions in the chat box.
Okay.
So the first one, so it's 4 now. First one is from Jonathan.
Yes.
And Jonathan's question is there any difference between a research philosophy and methodological choice? That's the first question from Jonathan. And the second question is from Kahilu. And Kahilu's question is, what is action research? When will it typically apply? That's the second question. What is action research and when will it typically apply? And the next one is, where does social constructivism fit? That's the third question. There are 5 now. So the fourth one is, can interviews, and that's from Rolling. The fourth one is from Rolling. And the question is, can interviews be a form of survey? And then the fifth one is from Caroline. And Caroline's question is, can these philosophies apply to all disciplines or only to social sciences? And then someone said, can you please provide some further clarification on abductive?
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Right.
Six questions.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I'm just checking my slides to see if I've got anything. Yeah. Okay. What I've made a note of all these, so we'll take them in with Jonathan's. Is there any difference between research philosophy and methodological choice? Yeah. You should see my screen changing for a minute, and that's because I want to put a slide up to answer Jonathan's question. Okay. Right. Right. Okay, you should see the onion up there again. Okay. Is that up? That's up. Yeah. Research philosophy, it refers to the 5 plus philosophies in the ones we've been talking about, the 5 of positivism, critical realism, interpretive, look at your ontology, your epistemology, and your axiology, and how these impact on the way you do research. Methodological choice, if you count from the outside in, which is the third layer in, a methodological choice is about the choice of methods you make. So whether you're going to use one single quantitative method, a mono method quantitative, one single qualitative method, a mono method qualitative, more than one quantitative method, multi-method quantitative, more than one qualitative method, multi-method qualitative, or you're going to start to mix your methods, so use both quantitative and qualitative methods, either in a simple way or a more complicated way. So hopefully, Jonathan, that's clarified that one for you. Then moving down, we had Kahil, who was what is action research? Okay. And so action research is a research strategy where you're working within an organization and working with that organization to answer a research question which is of interest to that organization. But at the same time, the research findings you have greater general applicability to the wider world or wider organizational world than just that one organization. So you're doing research with an organization to answer a research question of interest to the organization, but your findings have wider applicability. So that hopefully is clear for you, or if you Khalil. Then we had a question on social constructivism and where does it fit in? And you're probably, those of you can see me on the screen, I've actually pulled up a book to double check on this, because it's, you get to the stage where your brain starts to get fudged and then you have to start looking things up. So bear with me a moment. It's silly because I actually wrote it, so I now need to actually look at and see what I wrote. Why I'm getting confused is because there's social constructivism and social constructivism, and I'm just trying to get my head around which one I'm talking about. So, right, okay, yeah. Social constructivism it refers just to an ontological position, and so somebody who's a social constructivist, their view will be that reality is constructed through social interactions in which social actors create meanings, that these meanings are normally partially shared, and they also create partially shared realities. In other words, they socially construct realities. So in terms of that, that fits in that it's one possible ontological view, and then the ontological view you have makes up part of it's part of your research overall research philosophical view. So it's a way of it's one ontological view, and then your ontological view, which could be that or another or one of a number of other ontological views, then feed into what your overall research philosophy is. So hopefully that's sorted that one out. Then we had Rulan. Can interviews be a form of survey? Yes, I suppose they can. If you were to take a questionnaire as being a face-to-face questionnaire is a fully structured interview, so therefore you could argue that that form of interview is indeed a form of survey. But they won't be always, because normally interviews are semi-structured or unstructured and used either in action research or case study or perhaps ethnographic studies. And because they're only semi-structured or unstructured, they're normally only used with a small number of people, and surveys tend to be used with large numbers. So they can be, but they're not always. And then the final one was, can research philosophies apply to all disciplines? And the answer is every single person who is undertaking research has a research philosophy, whatever discipline they're doing, wherever in the world. What you will see is that natural scientists very, very strongly have one unifying philosophy across all the natural sciences, which nearly all of them use, and that's positivism, although we are seeing some natural scientists adopting interpretivist perspectives more. But the short answer to that is yes.
Okay.
Any other questions come in, Sam?
Yeah. Yes, Mark, there's two quick ones here. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read them out. So there's one from Kesiwa, and I think she's just following up on her question around social constructivism. And she's requesting if you can please give an example around social constructivism, just to help her understand it better. And then there's a second one from John. And John's question is, can pragmatism go with an inductive strategy?
Right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take John's question on pragmatism going with the inductive strategy first. And the answer is it could do. And where pragmatism would go with an inductive strategy was where you were trying to find the answer to a question which was of real value to an organization, and you didn't really have much idea of what was going on at all. So therefore you collect data to build the theory out of that to then be able to answer your question. So yes, that could work. And then the other question was looking at social constructivists and actually an example of it.
Yeah.
Right. So let's start back to a social constructivist believes that reality is constructed through social interaction where you create partially shared meanings. Okay. So I'm trying to think of it from an example which would work well at the moment. This is always the trouble when you get into these things. If we start to look at most of you are doing doctorates, so let's actually have we all have a reality. We all have an understanding of what a doctorate is, don't we? About what that a doctorate is a piece of research that is an individual piece of research which is normally undertaken over a period of 3 to 4 years, full-time equivalent, and is a piece of work which will provide an original contribution to knowledge. And we can agree with it that way, but the shared meaning of what we mean by original contribution to knowledge, we have to create by conversation and through social interaction, and we only start to do that by discussing what do we mean by an original contribution to knowledge. Is this an original contribution to knowledge? And that will be partially shared, and some people will have slightly different views, but we will all know that there is a thing called an original contribution to knowledge. But we have to socially construct what that is. Does that help? Does that help a little bit? Come back if it doesn't, please, in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, Mark. Thanks, Mark. There's 2 additional questions. Do you mind taking them?
No, not at all. Carry on.
Okay, cool. So there's the first one from Duke. And Duke is saying that I know that my philosophy is critical realism, adopting a mixed method strategy.
That's fine.
Can you please distinguish between the complex and simple mixed methods?
Yeah.
So that's the first question.
Yeah.
And then the second one is, can you please expand more on abduction? That's the second one.
Yeah.
And then the third one is from Jonathan. And Jonathan's question is, could you please highlight on the distinguishing features between a research approach and research strategy? That's from Jonathan. And then the next one is from Simpiwe. And Simpiwe's question is, that's the fourth one. And then there's a fifth one which just came in. So the fourth one is positivist always associated with quantitative data, or are there situations where it can be associated with qualitative data? And then the last one here is from Shadrach. And Shadrach's question is it safe to say social constructivist ontology is likely to be adopted by researchers in the interpretivism philosophy?
I think we're going to come back. I'm going to say with the ones you got. We'll come back to Shadrach's afterwards, because otherwise I'm going to get completely and utterly confused. All right.
Okay.
Okay, so let's first start off. And we had Duke asking about critical realism and mixed methods. Yes, that's absolutely fine to do that. But distinction between complex methods and simple mixed methods, yes. A simple mixed method design would be one where you started off in either quantitative and then went to qualitative, with the quantitative being dominant, the qualitative probably being less so. So you may start off with a questionnaire and then do, say, some focus groups to just look into to try and understand the reasoning behind the responses you're seeing. So an example of that would be some work I did a few years ago looking at the use of communication in organisation. We had this amazing finding that all shop floor workers on the production line never looked at notice boards, but people in the offices, the white collar workers did. And you could write some amazing sociological reasons for this, but we asked them in focus groups why they didn't look at notice boards, and they said, well, it's obvious they're at the front door and we go in through the back door. So you can see how the mixed methods simple help there. Another mixed method simple design would be where you start off with, say, some interviews to try and understand what's going on, and on the basis of those interviews you design a survey. A more complex mixed methods complex design would be one where you would, which we've done before, is where we started off with we did some in-depth interviews with senior managers. We then did some archival research looking at the documentation within the organisation. On the basis of this, we designed a questionnaire for staff, and we also designed a separate questionnaire for customers. And then, having analysed both those sets of data, we ran a series of separate focus groups with customers and with staff. So you see how that one becomes a lot more complicated. So that hopefully explains the difference between a simple and more complex mixed methods. The idea of abduction is very, very much focused in the realities of the way we actually do research. Research is very often presented as either being deductive or inductive. So of starting with a theory which you want to test in deductive terms, and then collecting the data to test it, and then that's done. Induction of starting with data, and then from that data building theory. The realities though of how we do research is whichever way we start, as we start to analyze our data, we come up with things we didn't expect, which a person doing abductive research would call a surprising fact. And on the basis of that surprising fact, we either have to redefine or develop our theory and or collect more data to see what's going on. And that's when, so the abductive research recognizes there will be surprising facts which will change from how we're doing research, from being either deductive or inductive, and then adopting the alternative view. So we move from, in a process of being abductive to deductive to inductive to deductive to inductive to deductive as we progress through, because of these surprising facts and new information we have which causes change to our theory. It could also be surprising facts that come from the literature as we read more. So hopefully that helps a bit there. Then we had, what's the difference between approach and strategy? On the onion diagram, which is up at the moment on the screen, I very much talk about approach as being the way we look at how we develop theories. So the idea of being deductive, abductive or inductive, as we've talked about earlier. Whereas when we look at research strategy, I'm looking at the overall design of, are we using a case study? Are we using a survey? Are we using an experiment? Are we using ethnography, action research, and so on? So that hopefully helps distinguish between the two there. We then had a couple of other questions, which are probably now about 6 or 7, I guess.
Well, it's 2 of them. It's still 2. Okay. Yeah, it's still 2. Can I just then read them out then quickly? Yeah. Okay. So we've got the first one from Shadrach. And Shadrach's question is, can we say that social constructivist ontology is likely to be adopted by researchers in the interpretivism philosophy? That's the first one. Okay, there's a third question now. So it's going to be 3. And then the second one is from a colleague. It's just the number I can see, not the name. But the question is research still qualitative where interviews are conducted using structured questionnaire and data analyzed statistically? And that question is from Josephine. It's from Josephine. And then there's a third one from Becky. And his question is, example of, sorry, I think he's giving, okay. And Becky, I'm not sure here, maybe you can turn on your mic and explain to yourself. But what I see is example of mixed method complex is equal to. Becky, do you want to explain this question yourself? Sorry.
Okay, I was just, when the question was asked about mixed method complex, I then said we can infer on it as being multi-method quantitative plus multi-method qualitative, while mixed method simple is basically mono method qualitative and mono method quantitative. So I was just giving distinctions there just in case, as an example, from inferring from the example that was given.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of simplifying it and getting over the main ideas. So thanks, Becky. That's really good. Right, Shadrock, can a social constructivist ontology be undertaken? Is that linked with interpretive philosophy? Short answer. The short answer, Shadrock, is yes, it does. And that was a nice. Then when we got to the second one, is research still qualitative when we have a structured interview or like a questionnaire and we get qualitative data out and analyze it quantitatively? What we've got there is we've got a questionnaire normally questionnaires collect data which will be analysed quantitatively, and that's because we have questions which are closed questions which are then very, very easy to code numerically. When we put an open question in a questionnaire, it tends to collect qualitative data which can be coded and so quantified, but it's incredibly time consuming. You imagine if you've got 200-300 questionnaires and in each questionnaire you have 10 questions which are open and people can write the answers they feel. To actually code that data is phenomenally time consuming. So we very, very rarely analyze those sorts of data quantitatively. We tend to analyze those data qualitatively. So yes, you can do it, but people tend not to, because the whole point of a questionnaire is collecting the same data in a structured format from a large number of people so that you can analyze it quantitatively. Normally you would only have 1 or 2 questions on a questionnaire which were open questions and would be collecting the qualitative data, and those questions you would invariably tend to code and turn into quantitative data. If you have the open questions and you're looking at the qualitative data, you tend to analyze it as qualitative data normally. Okay.
Yeah, Mark, sorry, there's just a quick one here. Can you say that mixed method goes with abduction? That's from that's from Asantewa.
Mixed methods.
Yeah, can you say mixed methods goes with abduction?
What I can say is mixed methods can go with abduction. It doesn't have to go with abduction, but it tends to go with abduction. I think what, guys, we're seeing now is that whereas when you did an undergraduate degree, everything was in black and white, and when you started to move to master's level, you got some shades of grey. Now it's a complete blurred grey mess, and it's much more difficult to work it through. And what you have to do is you have to create the arguments for what you're doing as to why you're doing it the way you are. Okay, what we're now going to look at, do a little bit more on deduction and abduction, just because I think that's going to be quite helpful for people given the number of questions we've got. Have we got any other questions coming through, Sam, or are we all right to move forward?
Yes, there's one which I think you missed, so let me just read it out quickly from Simpiwe. And his question is positivist always associated with quantitative data, or are there situations where it can be associated with qualitative data? The same applies for interpretivists.
Positivists tend to be very, very strongly associated with quantitative data. I'm very dubious about saying always and never, because I don't think we live in an absolute world, but then that's me not being a positivist. So yeah, nearly always. And then is interpretivist always associated with qualitative data, wasn't it? I think the next part of it.
Yes, that's what. Yeah.
Very strongly, but not. I would be very aware of saying always, but nearly always. So yeah, a tentative yes, I think is the best way of putting that. So let's. Anything else?
No, that's it for now.
Are you sure, Sam? I mean, I don't want to go. Okay, right. Let's have a look at deduction and theory testing, just to sort of bring that a bit forward. So deduction is operating like a scientist would be doing in a laboratory. So they're looking for causal relationships, and the method is very structured to collect these specific data to test this specific hypothesis and to do so. And because the testing is nearly always done statistically, we're looking at large samples, because a larger sample is often needed to ensure that the data has sensible confidence limits, and so we can be in terms of level certainty, and also we don't want the breadth of the data to be too broad when we're doing it. So we're looking at some confidence limits and certainty within that. So that really pushes us very much about quantification, and very much what we see here is, and it is the scientific approach of little steps towards increments to building theory. So we start off with a theory, we generate our hypothesis, we measure it, collect data to measure what we think is going on, and then we use that data to test the hypothesis, and then we adapt the theory. And that's pretty much a scientific approach and how deduction works. So if we now look at induction, so here we're starting off with a problem, complex problem, phenomena. We're starting off with data. We're starting off with observations, what we're actually seeing happening. And rather than focusing in the previous time on causal relationships, we're much more interested in understanding that the meanings and the context of what's going on. So the idea of this rich, informed picture of what's happening. And here you see me sort of being a bit like I was in the answer to those last questions on positivism and quantitative data, interpretivism and qualitative data. Here we have this tendency to qualitative analysis, but you can use quantitative, but it tends not to. And whereas it's a very structured research approach with deductive, or tends to be, what we have here is something which is much more flexible. So the research can alter as it goes along, and you can say, oh, that's an interesting issue coming up, and collect data. So it's less predictable. And it's likely here that you may end up with very, very different contributions to theory and things which, so it's radical change rather than incremental change. So in summary, you're starting off with a phenomena, so what you're observing in happening. You then understand place it within its broader context, collect data again, and you use the data to either generate an existing theory or to build new theory from it. So it's a different way of actually building. So it's theory building rather than theory testing. Okay. And then finally, abduction. So this is about theory generation and theory modifying. So as we've talked before, we're combining deduction and induction, and we're going backwards between theory and what we're observing. So we're, in effect, we've got a theory and we're going back saying, does that make sense? Testing it and moving backwards and forwards in almost a cyclical approach, as illustrated by the diagram below. And this surprising fact impacting on the conceptual framework or theory we're building, and then testing it and going round. Fits with a variety of methods, and you get a varied contribution to theory. Hopefully that's helped us pull that forward. Any questions, Sam, or were you able to move forward?
There is just one in the chat box,
okay,
from Ofente. And the question is, what method best argues with pragmatism?
Oh, pragmatism is wonderful. You can do what you want. Sorry, that was a flippant answer. Pragmatism, the crucial thing is the method best due to a research problem. So pragmatism it's very much, it depends on what the research problem is. Anything else, Sam? No. Let's go on then.
No.
Right. So
okay. Sorry, Mark. There's one. Sorry, Mark. There's one from Kesua, which is, does it mean abduction is not used to start? Kesua, it's not very clear. Do you want to?
I can see exactly what Kesua is getting at. It's a very common question, Kesua, and I'm really pleased you brought it up. What tends to happen with abduction is it's something that we move to after we've started. We normally start either as inductive or deductive, and with abduction, what happens is as we're working our way either through deduction or abduction, something comes along and you think that just doesn't make sense, or gosh, I never looked at it like that. And that that's when the abductive moment comes, that surprising fact. And so you then start moving between induction and deduction. So it was a really great question. Thank you. Okay.
Sorry, Mark. So as a follow-on to that, there's one from Linda. Guess who says thanks, by the way? She's happy with the response. There's one from Linda, which is abduction supposed to show in the literature review or just in the data collection, or both?
I think that abduction comes up in the methodology. So it's part of the method, not really the literature review now. Okay. Anything else, Sam?
No, that's it.
Right,
Thanks.
I'm going to change the slide. Boom, that's that cut out for a moment. Right. So what we're starting to do now is we bring this section towards a close. We've got only a few more slides before we move on to having a short break and then going on to some questions, open questions. This is what you need to think about in terms of your research philosophy. What's your starting point going to be? Are you starting from theory derived from the literature, or are you starting from what you see out in the field in your research organization, your research area? What research objects or phenomena are you focusing on? What theories are you going to choose in relation to these above? What data do you want to collect and how? How are you going to analyze it? How are you going to communicate your findings? How personally involved will you become in your research? What limitations will it have? And then finally, how does it all fit together? Which takes us back to this question I posed at the beginning. Is this extract systematic? Now, my guess is you've all wrote something down. Just go back to what you wrote down and just make sure and look at it and then say, now, do you think that this is systematic? I'll just give you a few moments to do that while I have a little sip of water. Because what this idea of being systematic about is it's about the fit between your research philosophy, your research strategy, and the methodological choices you make, and your research design, and then finally your data collection and analysis methods. Does it all fit together? So you've all got an idea of what you think for this. So let's actually now start to look at it. And is by systematic, is there this consistency? And the short answer is no. And there's an inconsistency between the first part, the bits I've highlighted in red, and the second part, the bits I've highlighted in blue. So it starts off saying it's based on the premise that there's very little actually known. So that very little actually known means that we're going to actually have to find out data and to understand what's happening. We have no idea. And so that immediately says that we need to do an inductive research, and we need to do in-depth, and we're probably going to be using qualitative type work. And that's formalized with first says, therefore we need to do an in-depth exploration, and it's going to look at interpretations. Now, when we see somebody saying we're going to look at interpretations, that starts to push us and suggest that they're going to be an interpretive strategy. We've seen the things of in-depth as well. So it's certainly pushing us down to a certain view of what this research is going to be, probably an interpretivist piece of work. And within that, it's probably going to be an inductive piece of work, at least early on. Then we get to the second part, and we have 200 questionnaires. And they're testing relationships between common causes of failures. And then analysing it quantitatively. So do you see what we mean here about the two halves of this extract don't fit together? First half is interpretivist, the second half is positivist. The first half is looking at a qualitative in-depth piece of research, or suggesting the second half is suggesting a quantitative, broader piece using a survey or a questionnaire in this case. So they don't fit together. Okay, I just wanted to finish for the first, before we move on to the final part of this, with a very short thing to say on the reading. And this is really crucial. I know Sam has got the slides and he can actually circulate the slides to you as well, but just to say that you can easily download the stuff we were talking about on philosophies and research approaches. And that's free, and there's the two websites to download it from. And just to say that it's been the most wonderful, without doubt, it's been the best experience I've had since the start of COVID. So thank you for making me have a wonderful day and feel happy again. It's been really, really, I appreciate all of you very much.